before I get started, my name is Ryan. How many veterans do I have in the room? Right over there? All right. That makes this easy. Can everybody read the slide?
Yes.
There's a reason why I ask you if you can read the slide, but before I get started, I'm going to talk about violence. I know most of the people in the room, I don't know everybody. There might be triggers you might not expect, because basically what I'm talking about is I'm talking about violence and narrative, and where violence fits in the narrative. And particularly when you have military violence, organized violence, how that works, and how you can use it in a story. So my disclaimer is realize that if you have been the victim of violence in your life, just be aware that we are going to be talking about violence. I don't normally sit down, but we'll see if we can keep me seated. I might try and escape. I promise I'll come back. But I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. How many people here have ever read Tim O'Brien's How to Tell a True War Story? Okay. We're going to try. So how many people ever played the game Two Truths and a Lie? More people? We're going to reverse this. I got 2 lies and 1 truth. All right? So I'm going to give you 3 war stories. I'm not going to say anything because people will start trying to read me. So I'm just going to put them up on there, and then we'll get a nod when we're ready to move on. So everybody kind of look me down, stare me down when we're ready to move on. Are we good with that? And we'll move through. So here's number 1. Stare down. Here's number 2. No typo. All right, and here is number 3. All right, so who here thinks that number 1 is a true story? Who here thinks that number 2 is a true story? Who here thinks that number 3 is a true story? My best friend Steve was stationed with me in Altus, Oklahoma. Steve was my best friend. We used to drink gin. However, Steve drowned in a swimming pool during crew rest. He was drinking. Him and his crew had a contest to see who could hold their breath the longest, and after a bottle of gin, Steve won. His name was Steve Haddon, United States Air Force Academy, class of 2001. My buddy, this is one of my first flights in Afghanistan in the MC-12, first example of where we actually did a live hit with a Hellfire missile. However, we did not do it. We were looking at the guy one day after the sun went down, and we remember he looked at me and he told me the story. And he said, and he looked at me, his question was, what would you do out here? This was in 2011. We're still there, but we wound down significantly. And he told me the story and said, I don't have an answer. This is why I will never win the war. And then the next day, the guy was walking away from a kid's birthday party to go take a phone call, and we blew him up. So that story is false. Option 3. That's a tabby and that's a calico. I have kittens here. Because what was happening, there's no way I'm sitting down this entire story. So there I am, in Kuwait. I'm the aircraft commander of a C-5. A C-5 is a big cargo plane. The nose comes up in front. When you fly that, you have a crew of dozens of people. And you don't really know everything, and we have a bunk room. We actually have a bedroom with 3 beds that you can go back and take a nap, because you got 24 hours that you're going to be on this airplane. So the trick is, when you've been on the plane for a while, when you're passing 10,000 feet, you can take off your seatbelt, right? That's when you can go to bed. So I'm in charge of this, and I'm like, hey, do you want to go to bed to the other pilot? There's 3 pilots. Do you want to go to bed? They're like, no, I'm up. I'm like, all right, I'm going to bed. And as I go to bed, I hear a commotion. And everybody on this airplane goes down the stairs. And it wasn't until 2 hours later, another thing about the C-5, the bathroom is in the back of the plane, and you have to go into the cargo compartment, walk through the cargo compartment, come back up to go to the bathroom. So the first thing I want to do after I get done sleeping is I want to go to the bathroom. And as I go there, and I'm putting on my boots, and you have to put on your headset to go down there because you need noise protection in case all of a sudden the airplane depressurizes because your headset's going to magically save you. I don't know. That's the rule. I didn't make it. So we're about to go downstairs, and my friend John, he turns around. He's like, "Don't go down there." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Don't go down there. There's a cat." And I'm like, "What the hell are you talking about? There's a cat down there." And this guy has a form that he's filled out, a safety report, an official Air Force form. form that he has detailed a vicious wildlife attack that happened downstairs. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because it wasn't until later that I walked down and saw the blood on the floor that I believed the narrative that was written on the floor, on the form. And this is what happened. And to picture this, has anybody ever seen Alien? Not the second one with the Marines, the first one. That's an Air Force movie, by the way. The cargo compartment of the C-5 doesn't have any of the noise-absorbing stuff or the upholstery, so it's just like the skin of the airplane, the beams and all the cables and wires, the flickering lights, and we have vacuum-wrapped cargo everywhere, so the pallets. So it looks like a scene from Aliens. And what had happened is, when you pass 10,000 feet, the scanner, who's a guy who walks around and tells you the status of the airplane, goes down and comes on an intercom and says one thing: we have a cat down here. And when he says we have a cat down here, everybody there all of a sudden says, I'm going down there. I have no idea what they're going to do. I asked them, what were you thinking? Like, there's a cat. Are you going to pet the cat? Are you going like, is this going to be your cat now? I'm like, what is going through your, because aircrew train, like the Southwest plane, when that just had the thing, aircrew train for every eventuality. I have a checklist that covers everything. From a loss of engine, to a sick passenger, to the bathroom not working, but nowhere in this checklist did it say, I really saw a cat. Right? So we go downstairs, and the entire crew goes down, and what they had forgotten is they thought they were hunting the cat, but in actuality, the cat was hunting them. Because what had happened is they go down, they forgot that nature made the cat stealthy and like gave it the advantage of climbing up top of the rafters, and the cat would leap on them. And like one of them got scratched in the face, and one of them got like cut, like the cat jabbed onto his hand, he had to fling it off. And they all ran upstairs bleeding. And then when we got to Germany, we tried to explain to them, there's a cat on board, don't open the door. But they didn't know what we were talking about. They thought there was like a typo in the form, and they opened the door and the cat ran out. And we found out later, over a search of the plane, that the cat was defending her 2 kittens, who were then adopted in Germany. And then we spent a week in Germany where the per diem is $119 a day at that point in time, so that was a $1,000 cat attack. So, thank you, United States government.
Did it delay you or anything?
Oh yeah, 1 week.
So they're like, we're all bleeding and stuff?
They were bleeding. He had to get rabies shots. Wow. We didn't have the cat. He had to get rabies shots. This could be a rabbit cat. Make sure he's giving the cat more tools, right?
Yeah.
So my name is Ryan, and I'm going to talk about how you tell a true war story. There's a couple things that I want to talk about here, and I had a teacher, Donald Anderson. He graduated from Iowa's creative writing. He teaches creative writing at the Air Force Academy, and he always teaches Tim O'Brien, and now he's teaching a book by a guy named Philip Clay, who was a PR officer who wrote about people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Sorry, not homecoming. Redeployment is the name of it. It's called Redeployment, which I highly recommend. But when we're telling stories, how many people here we already established, how many people here are veterans? We didn't have anybody. So I'm assuming that nobody here has actually done an act of deadly violence against another human being, and if you have, please don't tell me. So how many people have ran a game where you had somebody do an act of deadly violence against somebody? Okay. So let's think about that for a second, because we talk about, hey, how do we tell stories? How do we know? But there's other things. Is the thing that I want you to realize when we go through this is when we're talking about how you tell a true war story is what is truth, and what elements do you want to tell? But also tell this is a difference between what you think the experience would be and that there's people who have had the actual experience. So we're going to go over awareness of military service. We're going to talk about what isn't realistic in events. Anybody here boffer? Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about psychological stressors, which is only one of which is combat fatigue. And if I get any of you to do something, I will get you to kind of kill the PTSD-ridden veteran, not because it isn't true, but because it might be overplayed slightly. And then the essential military story, which you tell in long-form Larps, which is hurry up and wait, and how that can create a dramatic space. And then open up with a question, which is why tell a military story? Disclaimer, everybody's experience in the military is personal. I don't know what Daniel very well, I don't know what his background is. I always say that if you're talking to a military member from the US, you have to remember that we have a drastically different ops tempo. from anybody in a different country. So you can talk to somebody who was in a European military and they can talk about their deployment to Afghanistan or Iraq. But if you're talking to your typical Army sergeant who's been in for 8 years to 10 years, they're going to talk about their 4 deployments to Iraq and how they've been going more than not. So just remember, sometimes you'll have people relating experiences. It's like everybody's experience is unique and you have to respect that. And I intend to respect that here. I have veterans as a share of the population. And as you see, it peaked and is steadily dropping. We have never had as long a war as we are in right now. We are still at war. We've never had a smaller percentage of the population be at war. Right now we're at 7%. It is beginning to steady out, is what studies are saying. Why did it drop? Anybody? Why has it been dropping? Who's been dying? The GI generation. All the World War II veterans are dropping, right? It's going from like 1/3 of everybody to about 5 to 7%, depending on the age group, is what we're looking at right now. So racially skews slightly white. As the veterans get older, they get whiter, with increasing diversity, obviously, as they try and as they become and say, hey, we want to make it look more like the population. In terms of gender, it still skews very cis-male, although that is also decreasing. We have very few binary statistics as a very hot topic right now in the military, if anybody's following the news with that knows. And basically what I want to do with these slides is establish that military veterans do exist. You probably are going to run into a couple of them in your games, and you're not necessarily going to know if they are or aren't, and you're not necessarily going to be able, and you're not necessarily going to consider their experience because it's increasingly a rarity. I'm going to pick on somebody who I won't identify. They said something, I dragged them here, but something in the room is like, my parent was a veteran. I don't want to dismiss the experience of being a veteran's child, but it's a drastically different experience than being a veteran. I know from having my daughter that and also if you grow up, or if you are a heterosexual cis male who's at a military base at the age of 20 in the military, the people there, the locals there, you're going to meet many cis female daughters of military veterans, and then you can ask them, so your dad was in the military, what does he do? And the answer is usually terrible. It's like, you don't know, because you don't necessarily want to bring your work home. It's not like I want to tell my daughter, exactly how the kill chain works or what a JTAC is or something. That's not kitchen talk, that's not kitchen table talk. That's something that you want to kind of put. I bring up Phil Kay in Redeployment. I'll plug that book again because he really nails the dichotomy of what we're talking about here with statistics, is that we have 2 ideas of veterans right now in our stories. I see, and I would postulate. This is me talking. This isn't me citing anything. The one idea of the veteran we have, who wants to take a stab at the one idea of the veteran? What is big veteran? If I see a movie with a veteran, what is it? What kind of movie is it?
Oh, a type of movie?
What movie?
No.
What kind of veteran? When I say a veteran,
Old, jaded.
what war did they fight in?
Oh.
World War II.
Vietnam, and
yeah,
Korea.
probably Vietnam.
World War II. Korea's kind of like the one in the middle. That's the space in the middle, right?
World War II.
Most people can't tell me what the Korean War was about, but we know that there was a war in between Vietnam and it was a transitionary war. The war that they started Korea was drastically different than the one they ended. We have World War II, which by and large everybody fought in. You had total war, is what we would say. We didn't have much of a asymmetry between the 2 forces. They were equally committed. And when they came back, they were fully supported with the GI Bill and life. And the other thing is they didn't have any sort of really beyond print media at that point in time. You had limited radio media, and it was very corporate controlled. It wasn't anything like, they're not getting pictures that weren't released that weren't screened by the Army. And when you have Vietnam, now you had a narrative developing. You had Life magazine telling you about the war as it happened. And when you came back, you had another narrative coming back of the grizzled, disenfranchised veteran, which is very true for some people, but not necessarily a universal experience. But those are the 2 things. We have Oliver Stone's Bone on the 4th of July, which, if I were to postulate, was kind of a construct of the early 1980s, as the veterans of Vietnam began to tell their stories. And then you have, the idea of the greatest generation, also called the GI generation. Now we have a merger of those 2. What I would argue when I go back to Philip Clay, and when you're telling these war stories, and I would like to reinforce, is that we have those 2 things informed, and that when you have an Iraq or Afghanistan who is moving into a narrative space, like a city like New York, or moving into Larp into a narrative space, they have to deal with those two narratives, which are very different. And the two things that I found personally, and when I read this book, and when I talked to other veterans, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it afterwards, is that you want to be the same, but you also want to be acknowledged as different. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want anybody to treat me any differently as a veteran. I don't want to be like, well, I'm going to have to come up, are you going to be okay with this sort of thing? But at the same point in time, I will turn on you in an instant if you forget my military service. Does that make sense? And there's an irony there, and you have to be aware of that irony. And that really is what I would say defines what the 21st century American veteran experience. I talked about that a lot. The other thing that I would like to touch on is veterans do not have a monopoly on violent experiences, particularly if you're telling a LARP about violence, domestic violence. By that I don't just mean domestic violence as in violence within the home, but domestic as in police violence within the country or any other element like that. So I want to touch on some of those differences and say, when do I move from a story about violence, which have particular considerations? I think we generally have become, as a LARP community, better about using violence in our narrative to this is military violence, which is treated differently. Because I would not, without careful consideration, have a narrative in a LARP right now focused on spousal abuse. That's something that I'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This isn't something I just throw in there in your character background. We've learned that. However, at the same point in time, we do not hesitate to say, you fought in this battle. It's just something we do automatically. And why do we do that? We don't understand the difference necessarily. Let's talk about the differences. The first difference is there's much more deadly firepower. Okay, you are very unlikely in war to be injured twice, severely injured twice. Why? Because generally if you're that injured, it's one and done. So it's not like somebody is hitting you with a fist, or somebody is, physically restraining you. It is, you are being exploded, shot at, burned. This is something that is going to kill you. So it's not something, so it is a single point in your life that you experience it. Because of firepower is so much more deadly. It's professionalized, right? You have an expectation of violence. You have training. It's less warrant context. If anybody wants to write a book down to read about the expectation of violence, I have very complex feelings on this book. Please take everything with a grain of salt. But his name is S.L.A. Marshall, and the book is called On Killing. He wrote in Vietnam. You've read
Grossman.
What? Oh,
Grossman.
Grossman. But that wasn't Grossman.
Grossman's on killing.
Grossman's on killing. Grossman is on killing. S.L.A. Marshall is. Oh damn! Now I got the
Google it.
Google it for me. Thank you.
So what?
S.L.A. Marshall.
S.L.A. Marshall.
What's the name of his book?
S.L.A.
S.L.A. Marshall, and he wrote about the psychology of soldiers. This is where we get. Anybody ever hear the double tap? The double tap is just like which is right now triple tap, 2 and 3 in the chest and 1 in the head. The idea is that you need to train soldiers to shoot at human-shaped targets. This came from that. And he said that if I had people, his theory is that the only way that you can explain with everybody having machine guns and lethality rates in combat is that soldiers aren't actually trying to kill anybody. That was his thesis. Take it with a grain of salt. But he said that we need to train on human-shaped targets and that sort of thing so that people will shoot at a human-shaped target as opposed to I'm going to shoot at a round target with a bullseye in the middle, qualify expert, and then when I'm shooting a human-shaped target, I'm going to deliberately miss. Did you get the...
I see a lot of books, but like he wrote about Vietnam and all that stuff.
Yeah, S.L.A. Marshall.
But I think he was the one that
I'm sure it was Marshall.
Yeah, you shoot at. Yeah. We shoot at silhouettes now. Yeah. We don't shoot at targets for a reason. Yeah. Because in Civil War specifically, people, they were aiming.
In the Civil War, he was doing it. Yeah.
And they're aiming to miss.
Symmetric, and then the other thing that we look at I always caveat when I talk about symmetric that this day and age there's no such thing as symmetric warfare. But when I say symmetric, what I'm saying is that two groups are equally involved in the combat. It's really hard for me to describe a thing of symmetric warfare. It's much easier for me to describe asymmetry. If I am in an Afghan village that the United States is rolling up on, I'm totally engaged. Everybody I know is engaged in that fight, right? That is everybody I know lives there. That my entire group is engaged in that fight. Whereas an asymmetric, the United States, not every dollar, not every person in the United States is engaged in that fight. So there's an asymmetry. And the largest part of the asymmetry is the locale, I would argue, people would disagree around me, is the locale in which the violence occurs. These are some of the differences I would expect, particularly for an American veteran. We haven't had a war on American soil in, well, it depends on how you define it. I would say since the end of since the West was closed in 1890 is when I would call it that one. Like I said, knock on wood. So military violence is something foreign to our civilian population. We can look at the attack of 9/11, and part of the reason that was so shocking is that doesn't happen here, right? That was something, that's an example of, hey, and people are traumatized by it. It'd be very difficult to come to New York, have a convention in New York City and run a 9/11 arm. You'd have to have some guts to do that one, right? Particularly if you're not from New York. But that's an example of, hey, how when we start shifting this, people are like, military violence does not occur here, right? So these are some elements that you have to consider. What are some similarities? Let's deconstruct. In both cases, you have trauma. You have an attacker and the injured. Violence is something, violence done to the human body. At the end, if the severity is the same, it doesn't matter who shot you, where the bullet that shot you to you, the end effect is you've been shot. And the relationship between that trauma doesn't necessarily change if one side puts on a uniform or the other uniform on. And the idea of what is normal with that is that you're putting yourself in a context, and I think that you can relate this to different forms of violence. When you do a narrative with the military, you're saying, what is normal violence? And when you have normal violence, you have to say, how do I come out and what is my new normal? And I think that when we start talking about continuing trauma or trauma outside the military context, really what you have to say is, when you're in the military, not only is combat one thing that's normal, but there's a lot of normalized experiences. You don't need to learn anybody's name. Military people are notoriously bad at learning people's name. Why is that?
Soldier.
Because they wear name tags?
We all wear name tags. I don't need to know. I'm like, oh, that's Gomez over there. There we go. I was in a squadron, a mixed squadron between cargo and fighter guys. If you know any fighter guys, what do they go by? They go by their call sign. I knew Jammer. I think his wife called him Jammer. I'm like, and then his real name was Wesley. And that made sense because, no one would be afraid of the dread fighter pilot Wesley. But this is an example. What's normal? How do you go from that? How do you go to a point where you're evaluated, like your evaluations when you move to civilian? And a lot of the things that if you want to tell a military story, you have to consider leaving the military. You are going to a completely foreign environment to you now because everything was kind of regimented and taken care of you so that you could have a more normal experience when you're deployed to a foreign area. All these things make military war stories inherently problematic, and I'm not saying no say them, but that's some of the things that you have to consider. Here's some things that you might not realize, and when I talk about this, how many people here, here's a good one, how many people here have seen Star Wars? Okay? Who are the good guys in Star Wars?
The Rebels?
The Rebels. Who are the bad guys in Star Wars?
The Empire.
Let's talk about the Empire for a little bit. What is the Empire? How do we know? Can somebody give me a defining trait? A stormtrooper. What do they look like?
Armored,
The same.
faceless.
They're all armored. They all look the same. They're all wearing uniforms. They're all bearing assault rifles, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So, how many people here in a Larp have ever used uniformed, faceless, unidentified mobs as their villains?
Not in the Larp, but yeah.
But in a Larp.
Yes.
Is it right or wrong, and this is not value judgment, is it right or wrong to use a slur to dehumanize somebody you intend to kill? This is an easy question. Is it right or wrong to do that, to use a slur to dehumanize somebody?
I mean,
It is wrong. This is not a question. This is an easy question. I'm not trying to trick you.
I mean, it's a psych.
But what happened, now I have a question. How many soldiers do you think have used a slur when they were in that context to describe somebody they intend to kill? I will tell you, I'll do it. It's something that happened. How many people here have ever had dead bodies in the Larp? How many people here have ever had to move a dead body or deal with a dead body in real life?
Oh, no.
In real life. It's fucked up, ain't it?
Yeah,
It's
smells-
fucked up.
Smells.
Here's another one. How many people here have ever been on the wrong side of a news story, like a really bad news story?
In real life?
In real life. In real life. Have you ever been on the wrong side? Let me tell you how every news story, whenever there's violence, we just had one, and I don't want to politicize this too much, but we just had a terrible, terrible incident. Disclaimer, American Jew right now. In Israel with 60 Palestinians. I don't want to get into that, but we all have a narrative on that. I'm going to tell you, every time that there is violence, there are two sides. There's a side that won and inflicted the violence, and there's a side that has nothing to do but collect the dead bodies and talk to reporters. I'm not justifying or anything, but just realize that. Because I know that I have seen reports on things that I have been a part of that were 100% inaccurate simply because, what am I going to, and I can't blame them, they just got blown the fuck up, pardon me. What are they going to do? They're going to say, look how terrible this is, and everything that they have is terrible. But they're only going to show you the terrible side of the story because they're mourning their dead, and it can't be expected that they're going to give you a fair and unbiased account of what just happened. Something from the sky just blew up this home. These are the dead people. And you don't know what was going on in that home or how long it took before somebody decided to do that. I'm not even saying that they're staging or lying, that's a different story. I'm saying that the perceptions are different and you only ever get one side of the story. Why? Because the other side is debriefed, classified, filed away. And then by the time all that happens, the story's already happened. We got like 2 minutes. All right. So you want to figure out, hey, these are experiences that some of the people that veterans that you have are doing. What is realistic in the Larp? This is what you do right. If you have mass combat with minimal rules, you're going to be able to simulate some elements of warfare. The biggest thing that you're going to get is you're going to get chaos and perceived stress. Okay? I use perceived stress because it's a thing. Real world tactics do work. If you ever see Pippin, they actually have a song about that. I'm like, no, those are real words. They just didn't make something like, what's his name, to just make them up. And the duration of violence is often relatively realistic because you don't really have pitched long-term civil war battles anymore. Violence happens in spurts. And if you have a long-term battle, it's going to happen generally in spurts. Things that are fun in war games that you're doing right that aren't realistic, hit points are much more fun than actual wounds. It's nice. And if you have more than a few dozen people on either side, particularly in a BOF or LARP, you're probably not simulating modern combat at this point in time simply because of difficulties of simulating small arms fire. It's something that's difficult to do. I'll finish up with this. Here's some of the stressors I won't talk to because we're running out of time, but the essential war story, if you've ever been deployed, back me up on this, the number one thing that you're doing most of the time is waiting, right? Hurry up and wait. Get to this point, it's a giant logistics problem. Move over here and wait. All right, you wait. All right, go over there, eat something and wait. All right, go have a cigarette. Everybody smokes. Have a cigarette and wait. Why? Because what else are you going to do, right? You don't have internet, right? You don't have Wi-Fi most of the time. So it's a hurry up and wait. That's dramatic space because you know that something's coming. You know that, hey, go hurry up and wait over here. You need to hurry up and wait over here to get your armor. You have to hurry up and wait over here while they're passing out the ammunition at the armory. All these things are hurry up and wait stories. That's one of the things that I would say if you're going to try and do a military thing. Focus on the psychology of you know what's coming, you're preparing for what's coming, but you don't know how it's going to go, and you're going to have that chaos. Out of time? Got like a minute? So this is my open question to you guys. Why do we even want to tell a war story? I probably don't have time to answer that one, but why would you? I know why I would want to tell a war story. My question to you guys is why would you want to tell a war story?